Graphic testimony detailing allegations of abuse, violence, and threats by Sean Diddy Combs. We're talking about what the celebrity stylist, who was by Cassie's side for more than a decade, had to say on the stand. The brutal beatings Deonte Nash says he saw Combs lay on Cassie Ventura. How Cassie almost jumped off a balcony to escape Diddy at a hotel. And what Deonte Nash said happened when he tried to stop Combs in the middle of one of his alleged assaults. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. It was hard to read at times through the transcript of what Deonte Nash had to say on the stand, the celebrity stylist who worked for Sean Combs and was witness to the relationship that Diddy had with Cassie Ventura. In fact, he was the person who was in charge of how Cassie looked. Here's a sketch of Deonte Nash on the stand in Sean Combs' sex trafficking and racketeering trial. He said he worked for Bad Boy Records from about 2009 to 2018. He said it all started when he answered an ad on Craigslist. His first job at Bad Boy was as an intern. Eventually, he worked as the stylist for Cassie Ventura, Sean Combs' former girlfriend, the singer known as Cassie, who has been at the center of a lot in this case. Nash said that he and Ventura are still close to this day and that he witnessed a lot of what went on during her relationship with Sean Diddy Combs, including a situation where Ventura, out of fear, almost tried to go over a balcony of a hotel in Los Angeles, all allegedly to escape Diddy after an alleged assault. Nash told prosecutors that Combs regularly threatened to beat Ventura. He also said Combs' favorite name for Ventura was the B word. He said that Combs regularly called Ventura derogatory terms, words that I can't say here, but one of them begins with an S and the other begins with an H, and they often refer to prostitutes. Before we get back to this case, let's talk about a Law&Crime legal alert. Did you know that children under the age of 21 are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and research is potentially linking ultra-processed foods to these outcomes? Morgan & Morgan is stepping in to fight to hold food companies accountable. With decades of experience fighting large corporations, they're ready to stand up for families who deserve justice. So if your child under the age of 21 has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, go to www.forthepeople.com/food. Also, you can scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description. Nash said that Combs would say, quote, "He told her that she was just an outright H. He told her she was nothing but a S word anyway." Nash said that Combs often threatened to beat up Cassie. He also threatened to release sex tapes of her with other men, taped during those so-called freak-offs that are at the center of this case. And he also threatened not to release Cassie's music. Remember, Cassie signed a 10-album deal with Bad Boy originally, but only released one record during her time with Diddy's label. Nash went into extreme detail of the physical abuse that he says he witnessed at the hands of Sean Combs on Cassie Ventura. He said in 2013 that Combs was upset because Cassie didn't answer her phone at her apartment in LA because she was taking a nap on the couch. He said Combs then came to the apartment, he was angry, and he attacked. When the prosecution asked what happened, Nash said, quote, "Grab her by the hair, pull her off the couch, and start hitting her." He said Combs then allegedly continued to hit Cassie in a rage. Nash said that he, another alleged victim and former assistant who's now testifying in the trial named Mia, as well as Cassie, all tried to escape Diddy by running to the bedroom. But he says that Sean Combs followed and, quote, "hit Cassie until her head hit the edge of the bed frame." Even after that, quote, "he still continued to hit her for, a short time, and then he noticed blood and he just panicked," Nash said. Nash went on to say that there was so much blood coming from Cassie's head that they needed to get a towel to clean it up. Nash then said during the encounter that he tried to stop Diddy by jumping on his back, but he was thrown off. And that may be the first time that we've heard in this trial of anyone trying to stop Sean Combs from an alleged attack. Nash says that he started to call 911, but then he was told to hang up, but he couldn't recall who told him to hang up. Nash then said that Combs told him that Cassie was going to go to a plastic surgeon to get stitches and she would be accompanied by D-Rock. His name's come up a lot in this trial to this point. He's the security guard and friend of Sean Combs. That was just one of multiple physical altercations that Nash alleges happened at the hands of Sean Diddy Combs. And we found it notable to include what he says Combs allegedly said after Cassie was beaten so bad, in his words, that she needed a towel to clean up the blood and stitches after hitting that bed frame. Nash said that Diddy said, quote, "Look what y'all made me do." The next attack that Nash talked about happened later that year. He says either in 2013 or 2014, and it happened at the same place, Cassie's LA apartment. Here's a picture of her building on Google Maps. Nash said that Combs told him that he was coming over to speak to Cassie. Nash says as she was walking out, quote, "He grabbed her as they were walking out. He grabbed her like by her hair and the back of her shirt and started pushing her out. And he was like, 'I don't give an expletive. You going to get the expletive up out of my house. Y'all going to get the expletive up out of my house.'" The house that Combs was referring to was Cassie's LA apartment. Nash then said he and Cassie went downstairs and Diddy berated them. But eventually he says Diddy, quote, "let them go." But as they were driving down the road, Sean Combs called once again and he told them to pull over. When they pulled over, Diddy walked over to Cassie's window and Nash claims that Diddy said, quote, that he was going to put her sex tapes on the internet. He was going to release them on schedule and that he was going to first start by sending them to her parents' jobs and he was going to get them fired and that her brother was an expletive and that Puff was the only one that protected her. Nash then said he got Cassie a cab to get her away. He says Uber wasn't really a thing back then when you think back to 2013 or 2014. Nash, now at his house, says Combs came by looking for Cassie. Nash said that Combs was mad and he was looking everywhere in the house. He says that Combs even looked in the oven as if Cassie would be hiding there. Eventually, Cassie called Nash, and that is how Sean Combs found where she was that night, because she was calling from a hotel that Sean Combs knew in Los Angeles. And then Nash said Combs told him to go get Cassie. Nash says as he drove to the hotel, behind him was Sean Combs with his security in tow. You can just imagine this scene, an angry Sean Combs trying to find a girl that Deonte Nash saw him assault, and that girl is now hiding in a hotel just trying to get away. But Nash says when they got to this hotel, Combs told him to go get Ventura. Nash says he went upstairs. With him were members of Sean Combs' team, including that security guard, D-Rock. Quote, "I opened the door and turned on the light. The prosecution asks, what happened when you turned on the light to Cassie's room? She jumped," Nash said. "Who jumped?" asked the prosecution. "Cassie," Nash said. Nash said that Cassie was frightened. Diddy's security told her that Combs was downstairs and he was waiting. Nash then said, quote, "She said, 'oh no,' and then she went towards the balcony. She said she was going to go over the balcony." Nash said that the balcony was not on the first floor, but he couldn't remember what floor it was on. He then said that he and the security guards helped Cassie sneak out the side of the hotel. Nash said that he told Diddy downstairs that Cassie had left the hotel. Diddy did not apparently like that and allegedly told Nash that he felt like he was being played. Nash then said he drove home, but as he was driving back to his house, he noticed there was a car following him and one that belonged to members of Diddy's security team. Nash said instead of going home, he went to a hotel because he didn't think his house would be safe. In fact, he said when he got home the next day, his backpack was no longer there. And in that backpack was $1,000 in cash. He said he regularly kept that money on him to be able to get a hotel room so he didn't have to put his name down with a credit card. He didn't want to put his names down at hotels because, quote, "I didn't want Puff to find me." Nash also gave testimony about the so-called freak-offs that are central to the case against Sean Diddy Combs and what he said Cassie told him. He said in one case, Cassie was on her way to a hotel with a bag full of sex toys. When asked what Cassie said about having to go to these alleged drug-fueled sex parties involving escorts, he said that Cassie told him she did not want to go. Now that could be key testimony because the defense has tried to argue that the freak-offs were consensual. They showed text messages in the cross-examination of Cassie showing that at times she wanted to go. But Ventura told a very different story in her testimony, saying that they took a very physical toll on her to the point where she would get UTIs and she would need IVs to recover. Nash also talked about instances where Diddy allegedly assaulted him. He talked about one incident where Diddy was upset at the Vanity Fair Oscars after party after he saw Cassie's hair not put up in the way that he wanted. Nash said that Diddy grabbed him and lifted him up by the jacket, saying, quote, "I thought I told you she needed to wear her hair up." As you can imagine, once again, Diddy is described as being very angry. He also said, outside of a music video shoot, one that was never released involving Cassie, Combs choked him, once pushing him up against a car. Allegedly, Diddy was upset this time over how much he thought that Cassie and Nash were going out. On cross-examination, the defense's approach was very similar to what we've seen during this trial. An attempt to make the stories that the witnesses are telling seem more consensual and professional than maybe they were letting on. The defense pointed to the fact that Nash was very blunt in saying he did not want to testify or be involved in the case whatsoever, and they also pointed to how he would end meetings with prosecutors ahead of trial early. They also pointed to the fact that Nash has a lawyer himself, and they tried to get him to say that he was planning a civil suit against Sean Combs, but Nash denied that. They then asked about Nash's relationship with Diddy after he left Bad Boy in 2018. That is the same year that Combs' relationship ended with Cassie. The defense asked how Nash would characterize the text messages and calls that he and Combs had, to which he described as loving. When the defense questioned why, after allegedly witnessing so much violence at the hands of Sean Combs and experiencing so much fear because of Sean Combs, in Nash's own words, would he have a loving level of communication with Sean Diddy Combs, to which he said, "I mean, my whole 20s, this man's sanity was my safety. So it was what I was used to." Combs' trial is expected to last another month at least. Diddy is charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now to talk more about this is civil rights and criminal law attorney and former prosecutor Melba Pearson. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being here. Just reading through the transcript of what Deonte Nash said it was like to work for Cassie and Sean Combs and to kind of witness the alleged abuse in their relationship. How does what he said fit into what the government's trying to prove? It's not a domestic violence case, but as far as racketeering, sex trafficking, and the charges that Sean Combs is facing.
Absolutely. And Chris, always great to be on with you. I think that it's more about the credibility aspect, because we've heard from Cassie, a lot has been made of her credibility, as well as the fact that, well, she got a settlement of $20 million and things like that, and that she wanted to be there. This was a consensual type situation, that she wanted to be in these freak-offs. So Deonte Nash very clearly in many ways showed that that was not the case, that she would come back from freak-offs drained and upset. And he also was able to testify to the level of control that Diddy had over her, including refusing to let her record and release another album, that he had kept the tapes of her at the freak-offs and actually was threatening to release it to make sure that her parents got fired from their jobs. So in terms of the coercive nature of the relationship and whether or not she was doing these freak-offs and going from city to city with sex workers and things like that, this is another way of showing that this was not by any way, shape, or form consensual, that this was based on coercion because of the threats that Diddy regularly made, whether it was through violence or through extortion and blackmail.
And when he was talking with the prosecutor and answering their questions, he talked about verbal threats that he said Sean Combs would give him and give Cassie. Then he detailed a couple very violent physical interactions that he said he witnessed, even tried to stop Sean Combs at one point from attacking Cassie Ventura, and then goes into some of the testimony about the freak-offs and that she was leaving with sex toys, and then she would come back and as you're saying, being very drained. Of all of that, what would you say would be the biggest problem for the defense as far as what he talked about and the details that he gave?
I think the biggest problem for the defense overall is the fact that he very much backed up Cassie Ventura's testimony, as well as the testimony of some of the other former personal assistants who talked about the toxic environment and how basically everybody was there to serve Diddy. You know, the fact that there's security there and that they wouldn't even intervene when he was beating Cassie, again, shows the toxic workplace and the levels to which these folks were so afraid of him that they would not even do do what they would normally do in any other circumstance. So I think it's more about the fact that he lends credibility to some of the other testimony that we've heard so far in this trial. And he comes across as very disinterested, because I think it was this morning he actually said, like, listen, I didn't tell the prosecution everything. I tried to, in initial interviews with them, I tried to keep it very narrow and focused. And it seemed pretty clear that he didn't want to hurt Diddy, and he did not really even want to testify, period. So that reluctant witness coming forward and sharing such testimony lends to his credibility, and his testimony lends to the credibility of the other witnesses for the prosecution. So I think that's where the biggest problem lies.
He definitely, from the very beginning of his testimony, made it very clear he did not want to be on the stand. He did not want to talk to prosecutors. And even during the cross-examination with the defense was asking questions as far as, would you be here if you hadn't received a subpoena, that you met with prosecutors, but you ended these meetings early because you didn't want to talk about it anymore. Why would the defense bring that up? What point are they trying to make by pointing out the fact that Deonte Nash just did not want to be there, did not want to be part of, it seems, anything related to this trial?
That's another way of minimizing what happened to Cassie, and basically saying, listen, Diddy is not the monster, the demon that everyone is making him out to be, that these freak offs were more consensual, that yes, they had a toxic relationship. Yes, there was domestic violence, but by no way, shape, or form is he a kingpin. Should he be prosecuted or convicted, no less, of RICO and some of these other charges? So I think that that's where they were trying to go with that. And in some ways, they did score a few points, but again, overall, it's going to be a toss up in terms of if he's really going to be that great for the defense.
And one thing that I've noticed in just these domestic violence incidents, and certainly with Deonte Nash's testimony, is it wasn't just, this horrific, and just hearing about Cassie and how he was hitting her allegedly as her head hit a bed frame and she needed stitches. It's just a nightmare to think about. But also there was she goes to a hotel after another incident, and Sean Combs sends Nash in to go find her. And she's afraid. She almost was going to jump off a balcony because Sean Combs was downstairs. Nash was afraid that someone was following him. He says he never called 911, never filed a police report because he was scared of Sean Combs. How does that factor into what the defense is trying, or the government, is trying to prove? Because the defense has been saying this isn't a domestic violence case. You can hate what you saw in the 2016 video, but maybe that's a domestic violence. The fear part of it, that it just seems everyone had around Sean Combs. How does that factor into what the government's trying to prove?
Well, the fear is what bred compliance. And the fear is what allowed him to be able to operate with impunity in terms of committing an arson and blowing up Kid Cudi's car, or literally kidnapping Capricorn Clark at gunpoint and being like, you can't leave until Cassie gets here, or locking her in a room for 8 hours at a time for a total of 40 hours to make her take a polygraph with regards to missing jewelry. So it's that kind of fear and terror that would enable or basically compel people to cover up and do things that were criminal in nature, because of the fear of him that he would kill them or whatever the case may be. And so you heard about, folks getting drugs, whether it be prescription drugs in their name, that's not for them, that was for Diddy, or going out and getting illicit drugs for him and all of that. These are all criminal activities, and the prosecution is trying to show that he was using his companies to further criminal activities. And some of that included the drug use, which was part of the freak offs. Then, of course, the sex trafficking of bringing in sex workers and, going across state lines for these, for these freak offs and all of that, as well as the prostitution charge as well. So again, it's that level of fear that made the staff members comply and do criminal acts at his behest.
He was asked a lot as well about Cassie's music career. She signed this 10-album deal with Bad Boy. Only her debut album ever came out, but then they're talking about this mixtape that was never, I believe it was released, but then there were some music videos that weren't. Why does that matter? Why does the professional part of what Cassie was signed to do at Bad Boy matter in this case, where there's so much attention on the personal relationship she had with Sean Combs?
Well, remember, all of this came to be because she was signed with the label, and he, in my opinion, and I think most experts would agree that he groomed her and basically started a relationship with her. She was 19 and he was 37. So the whole carrot that was being held over her head for compliance was, if you don't do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, you're never going to be able to release another album. And remember, she's a musician. That's what she was here to do. She wasn't just like, oh, I met Diddy at a party and now he's my boyfriend. This was, I met him in the context of being signed, being an artist, and furthering my music career. And he started with the promises and the sweetness, etc. But then it became a carrot and a stick. So it was, okay, the carrot is, hey, you can release this mixtape, but the stick was like, but you have to do freak offs, you have to do all of these other things. So it's, again, is part of the context of why she was there, and also part of the control and coercion that forced her to do certain acts because she wanted her music career to move forward.
And looking at some of the questions, so you have his testimony when he's talking with prosecutors, and it's just reading it. It's very emotional, very graphic, talking about these incidents that he says that he saw between Sean Combs and Cassie Ventura. And then when the defense cross-examines him, it didn't, and this is just my opinion reading it, it didn't seem like it had as much emotion as what you were hearing during the direct there, where it was more like, okay, so she was in the studio. Let's talk about some of the big name artists that she worked with on even music videos that weren't even released. Oh, Bad Boy paid for this. And it's, what's the strategy the defense is doing by asking the questions that they did on the cross-examination?
Well, I think the defense was trying to show that she had more autonomy than was has been presented in the government's case. And so it's like, okay, she was hanging out with all these different artists, she was recording, she was able to move about freely. She wasn't captive, she wasn't a prisoner. And so that way they're trying to basically demolish the government's perspective and the government's view that she was basically captive and coerced to do every single thing every single day. Of course, it does not speak to the greater issues around being in a domestic violence relationship and things like that, and that you can be in a cage or in a prison without bars, right? There's other things that are keeping you there. There's other things that are forcing you to do, certain actions that you would not normally do otherwise. So the defense is trying to paint a picture of her being very autonomous and maybe in some ways being a puppet master. We saw that kind of coming out in the cross of Kid Cudi, that, oh, both of you got played and things like that, which was completely ludicrous in the context of his testimony, but that's a separate issue. But again, it just shows the different ways the defense is trying to discredit Cassie and her testimony.
In your experience, because a lot of the dates that Nash was talking about, we're talking 2013, 2014, and this was after Kid Cudi and what happened to him in 2011, 2012. So she goes back to Sean Combs after that brief period of time that Kid Cudi thought they weren't together. And then here she is, according to Nash, just being beaten. In your experience, how much of an understanding do juries typically have of how these domestic violence filled relationships can work, and why in many cases it's not easy for people to leave these relationships and they go back even if they were victims of physical violence like Cassie Ventura is alleged to be?
Well, I think jurors and people in general have a surface understanding of what domestic violence looks like, and they may be very familiar with the after effects. I mean, thinking of, let's say, the O.J. Simpson case and other high profile cases, people are like, "Oh, okay, I get it," right? But it's a little bit harder with a living survivor, because of the fact that there's that, well, why did you go back after he kicked you in the head? Why did you go back after he threatened to get your parents fired? Like, all of those things, I think people look to themselves and think, I would never tolerate that, so why is she doing that? And of course, they're looking at her being young and beautiful, and she's a musician, she's in this famous circle, and it's very easy to go down the path of, oh, she chose to be there because she wanted more fame, she wanted more money, et cetera, et cetera. But that completely glosses over the horrible, horrible realities of a domestic violence relationship where it's complicated. And the reality is, you don't get beaten every day, right? There's going to be days where it's the person is sweet, the person is kind, and you're like, oh, this is the person I fell in love with. And then the next week, the next month, the next day, the next hour, whatever the case may be, something terrible happens. So there's a whole psychology behind it that is very nuanced and can be complicated. And like I said, people do get the surface understanding, like, okay, you don't hit your girlfriend or you don't hit your partner or whatever the case may be. But when you get to that deep nuance, when it's, years and years and years of horrific abuse and hearing some of the extreme things that she did, most people, like, I can't even get my mind around the things that she was forced to do, much less how she was able to stay in that relationship. So I think the fact that Don Hughes, testified did help give some light and some perspective to the jurors about how these relationships work, including talking about trauma bonding and how it's almost like, I always like to say, it's like almost like Stockholm syndrome, right? Like, you start to fall in love with your captor and your abuser, and suddenly their issues become your issues, and their goals become your goals, and you're doing everything in service of this relationship. So, I think she broke down a lot of the different nuances that a lot of folks don't really think about when it comes to domestic violence relationships.
Deonte Nash had a very interesting answer when the defense asked him about what his relationship was like with Diddy after he stopped working at Bad Boy in 2018. And he said that the text messages they had, they didn't see themselves in person, but they had text messages and he considered them loving. And I would think that the defense was thinking, well, here we go. We're showing, once again, that things weren't as bad. And I thought he had an interesting answer. And he said the reason why they were loving was my safety was his sanity throughout my 20s, something like that. I just thought that was an interesting answer. Like, is that the type of answer that can have an impact on a jury?
I think it can, and it's one of those mixed bags, right? Because in a way, I'm looking at all this testimony and it feels very Machiavellian. Like, everybody had seen the most horrible things, like him beating someone, a gun was held to their head. They saw him get ready to go kill somebody, the whole Suge Knight incident, that sort of thing. But yet everybody still says, well, working with Diddy was the best time of my life. And, I still have respect for him. I've nothing but love for him. So it's like, what kind of cult
Right.
is this, right? That's kind of like my initial reaction, just looking at it. But again, if people are thinking, and hopefully in closing arguments, the government will really bring this out, that these are folks that still work in the industry for the most part. Some have moved on and have done different things, but some of these folks still work in the industry, and they're afraid that the power that he may have may still extend to certain quarters, because Diddy still has supporters. I mean, Suge Knight came out and said, even though they're sworn enemies, that he didn't think he should be prosecuted. So they may be afraid of backlash for their career, but then they also separately, after seeing what they saw, may have been afraid still for their own safety, because again, he's a multimillionaire, he has resources. They all saw what happened to Kid Cudi. And so again, they're trying to preserve their safety by saying, hey, I'm cool with him. I keep him at a distance, but I'm cool with him because I want to make sure that I'm safe. So the prosecution's really going to have to bring that home in closing to make sure that the jury understands some of the potential reasoning behind some of these responses.
In Melba, we're still somewhat early in this case, several weeks to go in this trial. But at this point, when you look at what's happened in the courtroom thus far, where is the government most vulnerable in their arguments against Sean Combs?
I think there's a few levels of vulnerability. Number one, I think the sex trafficking. While I think the sex trafficking and the prostitution charges are going to be the strongest at this juncture, while I think the prosecution has done some good work in terms of setting forth the RICO aspect, I think that jurors may still struggle with that. Again, the threshold for RICO and the way that it's charged is very low in terms of he doesn't have to be the one to have done these acts. They just have to have done it at his behest. And but I think people may still struggle with that. So that's where I think the vulnerability is, the understanding of RICO and how that could apply here. Sex trafficking, again, you're crossing state lines, purposes of, for having sex. There's coercion involved because of the horrible toxic domestic violence relationship happening there. I think the government is on pretty solid grounds there. And prostitution, that's a no-brainer, because clearly prostitutes were hired. End of. Sex workers, were hired. End of. So I think RICO is going to be their biggest vulnerability right there. But again, it's the feds. They don't move unless they have the Brinks truck of evidence pulling up to the courthouse. And that's why they have a 99% conviction rate. So there may be more surprises in store. They are talking about resting somewhere the third week of June. So there's plenty more trial to go and lots more testimony and evidence that may definitely tip the scales, in their favor.
Yeah, we'll see what happens next. Melba Pearson, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.